We are pleased today to have Professor Stephen Riep as our featured House of Learning speaker. His address is entitled, "The Moral Universe of Martial Arts Cinema." The library sponsors three main lectures and lecture series: the annual Author Lecture, the House of Learning Lecture Series, and the Alice Louise Reynolds Women in Scholarship Lecture. Through these lectures, the library brings scholars and students together to engage in a civil discussion of ideas, and in so doing, the library contributes to building a learned community which fosters the faithful life of the mind. The House of Learning Lecture Series title is taken from the 88th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, verse 119, where the Lord instructs the saints to prepare every needful thing, even a house of learning. Because the library is the campus repository for the literature of all academic disciplines and scholarship, the library is well positioned to be considered BYU's House of Learning. The Harold B. Lee Library takes seriously its campus role as the intellectual heart of inquiry and knowledge, and is honored to provide this House of Learning lecture today. Now, about today's speaker. Professor Riep is an accomplished scholar of Asian culture. He received his BA in Chinese and Political Economy at the University of California at Berkeley, and his MA and PhD in East Asian Languages and Cultures from UCLA. His familiarity with Asia is extensive, including 7 years living in Taiwan as a missionary and as a Fulbright and as a Rotary International Scholar. Before coming to BYU, Professor Riep taught at UCLA and at the University of California at Davis. Among his many publications are chapters in anthologies which analyze Chinese cinema and film in the 1930s, as well as assessments of more contemporary images of the disabled in films of the Far East. In addition to his exceptional scholarship, Professor Riep is mentor to his students. Ladies and gentlemen, please join with me in welcoming today Professor Stephen Riep.
Thank you. I am honored to have this opportunity to address you today. The topic I am speaking on is a new one for me, but it touches on a variety of research and teaching areas in which I have great interest, including contemporary Chinese cinema, cultural production under authoritarian regimes, and traditional Chinese civilization. Virtually all of the works I discuss today, including 2 of the films, are part of the Lee Library's collections. Information on their call numbers is included in the handout that is being circulated and is available at the back of the lecture hall. I hope that you will take time to go and borrow them, take a look at them, and enjoy them, because I think that's the best way to truly develop an appreciation for this topic. In the wake of the Bosnian War that raged from 1992 to 1995, fighting had devastated the city of Mostar and destroyed its treasured 300-year-old bridge, pictured on the left. The Muslim, Serb, and Croat populations sought to select one hero they could all look to, one free from parochial, political, or cultural ties, one whose statue they would proudly erect in the city's center. They settled on Bruce Lee. Why Lee? The childhood idol of many, Bruce Lee stood for, and I quote, universal justice, end of quote, and represented, quoting again, loyalty, friendship, and skill, end of quote, values that all of these ethnic groups admired. These values were not, of course, unique to Lee. They have roots that reach far deeper into China's remote history and extend out to the present day. For Lee is only one example of the Chinese knight-errant tradition. The Chinese knight-errant are wuxia, men and women who fought for justice in times of lawlessness and despotism, who offered their protection to all without regard to class, gender, or relationship. While we may be most familiar with the Chinese knight-errant from Bruce Lee's Enter the Dragon, Ong Lee's Oscar-winning Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, or Chinese director Zhang Yimou's recent Hero in the House of Flying Daggers, the fact is that the tradition goes back a lot further than that. Chinese audience members may, of course, know that it reaches back to the 60s and 70s, films of director King Hu, and of course the best-selling martial arts fiction of Qin Yong. But the story does not begin here either. It goes back to the mass-market martial arts stories that circulated among readers hungry for popular, as opposed to highbrow works, from the turn of the century through the 1940s and even back further to late imperial China and to the great masterpieces of fiction, including the great novel The Water Margin. But its earliest manifestation are found in the historical records of early imperial and even pre-imperial periods that date back to 300 years before Christ. I would like to introduce the rich history of the knight-errant tradition and its moral universe in literature, and then explore how they have shaped the modern martial arts film. I will show clips from and then analyze King Hu's landmark film, A Touch of Zen, and then move on to Ang Lee's Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. And finally, if time permits, we'll look briefly at Feng Xiaogang's World Without Thieves, showing that both continuities and differences exist and are woven into these films and into the tapestry that is the wuxia, or knight-errant legacy. The term for knight-errant, James J.Y. Liu tells us, was originally youxia, or wandering knight, suggesting either their peripatetic existence or their willingness to travel to avenge the wronged. While their origins are subject to debate, they shared in common a series of values rooted in their desire for justice that transcended familial and political loyalties. In the Confucian tradition, and this is the dominant philosophical tradition in China, obligations were based on 5 cardinal relationships of father and son, husband and wife, older brother and younger brother, ruler and subject, and friend. This meant one owed supreme loyalty to one's father, hence the importance of filial piety, that is to say, the respect children owed to their parents. As Confucianism became established as the dominant state ideology during the Han Dynasty, and the handout has a list of chronological table at the bottom of the first page for your reference. But as the Confucian ethical system became dominant during the Han Dynasty, the first long-lived imperial dynasty of a unified China, the relationship of father and son and the loyalty that attended it became the foundation for justifying the officials' and the subjects' obligation to serve state and ruler, as found in the classic of filial piety. In contrast, the knights-errant sought to see justice serve without regard to predetermined relationships, and thus offer aid to anyone in need, regardless of gender, class, or religious background, which made them altruistic in a way that a Confucian scholar might not be. A number of other core traits derive from the altruism and love of justice, prizing personal loyalty over institutional loyalty, for example, the importance of honor and integrity to one's own principles rather than social conventions and customs, and the prizing of personal freedom over conformity to law. Obviously, this left room for excesses. Knights-errant could at times be impetuous and arbitrary, frequently sought revenge out of proportion to any provocation, punishments not fitting but exceeding the crime, to tweak W.S. Gilbert, and paid no heed to the law or to justice for society. But at times when society was in disarray or when a tyrant ruled and justice could not be served, the knights-errant came to the fore to help reestablish order. I would now like to turn to 2 early examples of knight-errantry. The first is entitled The Biography of Yurong, and this comes from the first great comprehensive history of China compiled in the Han Dynasty by the great historian Sima Qian. And in this particular account, Yurong, who had served a variety of states, finally achieved recognition and honor from the Earl of Zhi. When the Earl is killed at the orders of Lord Xiang, whose kingdom the Earl had attacked and not been successful at defeating it, Yurong decides to avenge the killing of the man who had shown him favor. And I quote, "For a man to die for one who understood him is like a woman making herself pretty for one who loves her. Since the Earl of Zhi understood me, I should sacrifice my life to avenge him. If I can repay him in this way, my soul need not be ashamed." Yurong disguises himself as a criminal and entered Lord Xiang's palace, where he conceals himself in the privy and waits for his prey. When Xiang enters, he discovers the disguised Yu, has him searched, and finds a concealed dagger. This would-be assassin confesses that he sought to kill the nobleman to avenge the death of the Earl of Zhi. And the Lord respects, his moral motivations. These are things that the Lord Xiang can respect, and he frees him. Well, Yurong was not so easily deterred. He still had this debt he had to pay to avenge the death of the man he had served, and so he again disguises himself in an attempt to kill Lord Xiang. This time he's captured, and when questioned by the Lord, Yurong reveals the following, and again I quote, "When I served Fan and Zhonghang, they both treated me like a common fellow, and I therefore repaid them as an ordinary fellow might. But the Earl treated me like a man of national eminence. and I thus must requite him as a man of national eminence should." End of quote. With no hope of escaping death, Yurong asks Lord Xiang if he would allow him to make a few strikes at the Lord's robe with his sword, thus symbolically fulfilling his debt to avenge the Earl of Zhi. Lord Xiang, again, still admiring Yu's sense of duty, agrees, and after making a few stabs at the robe, Yurong falls on his sword and dies. In this case, it is the personal relationship and the moral obligation and personal loyalties that stem from it that motivates Yurong to go to such great lengths to sacrifice his life in avenging the Earl. He'd served other people before. There's no reason why this particular ruler he would have to avenge if it's simply a matter of serving one's ruler. But if it's serving a ruler because he has shown you personal favor and honored you, then a bond is created. The second early example is a poem, and this gives us a sense of the life of a wuxia from the perspective, in this case, of the poet Jiang Hua, who lived from 232 to 300 AD. This is the first of the two songs of knight-errant. The knight-errant loves a secluded place. He built a chamber behind a desolated hill. He went hunting but found few animals. He spread a net but caught no birds. The year is ending, bringing hunger and cold. Heroically he sings, beating time with his foot. Poverty stirs up a brave knight's spirit. How can he cherish bitterness in his heart? Sitting alone, he strokes his precious sword, now fast, now gently, as if playing a lute. He plows the fields on the slope of a dry ravine, but his real seeds are sown at the tip of the sword. He reaps his harvest among narrow paths. One blow is worth 1,000 pieces of gold. He takes his rest among bears' dens and roams in a forest full of tigers and leopards. Zhang's poem casts the wuxia as a noble fighter living on the margins, a theme found in later poetry and in the classical and vernacular tales that proliferate in the Tang Dynasty and afterwards. But the masterwork of pre-modern martial arts literature was the novel The Water Margin, written in the Ming Dynasty, but set and based actually on anecdotal information and some historical accounts from the earlier Song Dynasty. This text discusses the adventures of gallant bandits who come together under the leadership of one Song Jiang. They later surrender to the government and eventually fight for the empire to suppress rebellions and preserve the state. In other words, they go from being outlaws to being allies of the state. Early versions of these narratives can be found in the Golden Age Yuan Dynasty drama, Li Kui Carries the Thorns. And the illustration on the left here is a woodcut illustration from a Ming Dynasty edition of the Yuan Dynasty drama. But it is as a novel that the exploits of Song and his men are best remembered. And the illustration on the right, by the way, is another image of Li Kui. And here we have two more images of heroes from the novel. These illustrations come from a contemporary edition of the novel and depict several of the knights errant, who the narrative introduces with great care and attention, providing models for later martial arts novelists to follow. This final illustration shows the opening page of an early edition of the novel. This is a Ming Dynasty edition of the novel, I believe. In the centuries that followed, short stories and novels centering on a knight errant continued to remain popular. They formed the basis for the plots of a new form of theater, Peking opera, in which knight-errant characters perform complex acrobatics in stylized scenes of combat. In the early years of the 20th century, martial arts stories became a staple of popular fiction, the so-called Mandarin Duck and Butterfly School, which also included love stories, mysteries, and scandal-mongering literature. Widely serialized in magazines and collected in cheap paperback editions, martial arts fiction remained popular to 1949. In Hong Kong in the 1950s, what was termed New School martial arts fiction took the territory by storm as the stories of a mainland Chinese immigrant, Louis Jia, better known by his pen name Jin Yong, were serialized in local newspapers. Jin's finely crafted stories with their well-developed characters, intricate plots, and ties to Chinese history and traditional culture have captured the imagination of millions of Chinese readers, making him the most read of any 20th century Chinese author. Certainly any of the mainstream authors, and he's still very, very popular today. Martial arts entered the world of cinema via the influence of wuxia-inspired Peking operas and the mass-market martial arts novels popular in the early 20th century. David Bordwell reveals that these sources provided material for a burgeoning film industry in the 1920s. They remained a mainstay through the 1940s in both China and Hong Kong. In the years after 1949, Hong Kong and Taiwan became the centers of martial arts film production as literature and the arts in China became politicized under the socialist realist cultural policies of Mao Zedong, a film genre that mingled the traditional and the fantastic, which knight-errant cinema does, simply did not serve the needs of a new communist-governed China. In Hong Kong in the 1950s and 60s, Bordwell notes, the fantasy martial arts film became popular and left their legacy on the techniques of martial arts filmmaking. The Mandarin martial arts films made by Hong Kong studios like Shaw Brothers aimed for more realistic portrayals of real warriors with outstanding fighting skills. Now, perhaps the best known of these directors was Hu Jinquan, or as he is known in English, King Hu, an actor turned director who reshaped the face of Chinese martial arts films from 1966 to 1975. I would like to focus on Hu's 1971 masterpiece, A Touch of Zen. Before I do so, it's worth looking at these pictures. Does anybody recognize this individual?